My name is Serena, and I am 28 years old, and my parents secretly intercepted my elite international fellowship documents and resubmitted them under my sister's passport identity. And I did not find out the way most people find out about betrayal through a screaming match or a confession or a tearful phone call. I found out on a Monday morning at my desk at exactly 8:51 a.m. while drinking my first cup of coffee and processing a routine batch of international academic passport applications on a high-security government terminal that only 4 people in the entire country have the clearance level to access. And I am one of those 4 people, and I have been one of those 4 people for 3 years. And in those 3 years, I have seen document fraud, I have seen identity substitution, I have seen forged biometric submissions, and I have processed every single one of them with the same expression I am wearing right now, which is no expression at all. I work at the Global Scholar Passport and Fellowship Verification Bureau, and my official title is Senior International Academic Travel Clearance Officer. And what that means in practical terms is that every single international fellowship passport application that moves through the Oxford Elite Scholarship Foundation, the Geneva Academic Mobility Council, and 14 other Tier 1 global scholarship bodies passes through my terminal before any travel clearance is issued, and before any funding disbursement is authorized, and before any visa status is confirmed, and I sit in a room with gray walls and fluorescent lighting and a terminal screen that is larger than most televisions, and I verify identities, and I cross-reference biometric data, and I confirm that the person receiving a £180,000 fully funded international academic fellowship is in fact the person who earned it. The Monday morning batch arrived at 8:44 a.m., and it contained 31 applications from the Oxford Elite Scholarship Foundation's annual cohort processing cycle, and I opened the queue the way I always open the queue, which is in silence with my coffee to my left and my administrator confirmation keycard sitting flat on the desk to my right. And I began moving through the files one by one, and each file contains a passport scan, a biometric profile, a full academic history, a birth registration marker, and a fellowship award letter, and the system automatically cross-references all 5 data points before I even touch the keyboard, and it assigns each file a preliminary status code, and most files come through with a green preliminary status, and I simply confirm them and move on. And the whole batch usually takes me about 40 minutes. I was on file 17 when I stopped. The preliminary status code on file 17 was not green. It was a level 1 document conspiracy flag, and the system had generated it automatically before I opened the file, and the flag existed because the biometric data submitted with the application did not align with the academic birth markers attached to the original fellowship award. And what that means in the language of the system is that the person whose face and fingerprints were submitted with this application is not the person who was originally awarded this fellowship, and the system knew that before I did, and it flagged it, and it waited for me. And I opened the file and I looked at the name on the passport submission, and the name was Vivienne, and Vivienne is my sister, and she is 25 years old. And she has never in her life demonstrated academic distinction of any measurable kind. And then I scrolled up and I looked at the original fellowship award letter attached to the base of the file, and the name on the award letter was my name. And the award was the Oxford Elite International Research Fellowship, valued at £180,000, and it was awarded to me 14 months ago. And I have never seen this letter before in my life because I was told I did not receive it. I sat very still. I thought about the 3 months my parents spent telling me that Oxford had rejected my application. And I thought about the particular way my mother said it, which was not unkind, but was also not warm. And she said these things are very competitive, Serena, and perhaps next year. And then she moved on very quickly to talking about Vivienne. And I thought about sitting in my childhood bedroom in the dark after everyone had gone to sleep and feeling the specific weight of believing I had failed at something I had worked 4 years to achieve. And I thought about how my parents had celebrated Vivienne's sudden announcement that she had been awarded a prestigious international placement, and how my father had used the word genius in reference to my sister for the first time in her entire life. And I thought about all of that for approximately 11 seconds, and then I picked up my administrator confirmation key card and I entered my senior clearance code into the terminal. I did not call my mother. I did not call Vivienne. I did not send a message to anyone. I entered my confirmation key, and I watched the automated global protocol initialize. And at 9:12 a.m., the system permanently revoked Vivienne's international travel visa clearance across all 147 affiliated passport jurisdictions and issued a cross-border asset freeze notification to the primary bank accounts registered under my parents' home address, and my coffee was still steaming. And I had not yet reached the 18th file in the batch. It was 2:15 p.m. on Monday afternoon, and I was still at my desk on the 8th floor of the Central Passport and Clearance Operations Room, and the gray walls were the same gray they always are, and the fluorescent lighting was the same white. It always is. And the terminal in front of me was displaying the Global Border Compliance Grid, which is a live system that tracks every international travel clearance event connected to any passport file that has passed through this bureau. And I was monitoring it the way I always monitor it, which is with complete stillness and complete attention and no visible reaction to anything I see on the screen. And there was a great deal on the screen that afternoon, because the morning's Level 1 document conspiracy flag had expanded automatically through the system's own internal audit logic and was now touching every connected database that Vivienne's fraudulently submitted passport identity had ever interacted with, and the system was doing what the system was built to do, and I was simply present to observe it. At 2:47 p.m., I refreshed the compliance grid, and the Oxford Elite Scholarship Foundation's travel coordination portal had already updated Vivienne's status from fellowship confirmed to fellowship suspended pending federal identity review, and that update had been generated entirely by the automated protocol, and I had not typed a single additional instruction since entering my confirmation key at 9:12 that morning. And that is the thing about working inside a system like this one for 3 years, which is that you understand that the system does not require your emotion and it does not require your intervention. Once the mechanism has been activated, and it simply moves, and it does not stop moving. At 3:40 p.m., the compliance grid produced an alert ping. The ping was tagged to Terminal 7 of the International Departures Hall at the airport, and it was a biometric barrier event, and the event code was a Level 1 travel ban activation, and the name attached to the event was Vivienne's. And what had happened was that Vivienne had approached the automated biometric check-in station for her Oxford flight, and the scanner had read her passport, and the scanner had cross-referenced her passport against the global revocation registry that my morning confirmation had written her into, and the barrier had not opened, and the barrier was not going to open. And the screen at the check-in station had displayed a credential suspension code in large red text, and within 4 minutes of the initial ping, the compliance grid showed a secondary alert, which was a security detainment log indicating that airport border officers had escorted Vivienne to a secondary screening room for credential mismatch review. And that log used the words suspected document irregularity, and it used the words identity verification hold. And I read those words, and I felt nothing except the specific clarity that comes from watching an institution process the truth at its own pace. At 3:52 p.m., the asset freeze module that had been initialized that morning as part of the cross-border protocol reached the payment systems layer, and the terminal showed a notification that my parents' linked credit accounts had been automatically declined at the airport retail zone, and I noted the time and I returned to the compliance grid. At 4:03 p.m., my personal mobile phone lit up on the left side of my desk. My mother was calling. I placed the phone face down. It lit up again at 4:05 and again at 4:08 and again at 4:11 and again at 4:14 and again at 4:19. And I watched the screen pulse with light 6 times in 20 minutes. And I did not pick it up, and I did not turn it over. And I did not feel the pulling sensation that I might have felt 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, or even 1 year ago, because that sensation requires a version of me that still believed my parents were operating in good faith. And that version of me had dissolved very quietly at 8:51 a.m. when I scrolled up and saw my name on a fellowship award letter that my mother had told me did not exist. While the phone was still lighting up, I watched the compliance grid show the automated fraud audit loop, expanding its reach into my parents' joint retirement account and into the mortgage servicing file attached to their home, and the system had flagged both as assets connected to a credentialed document conspiracy event and had issued a federal hold notification to the relevant financial institutions. And none of that required my signature, and none of that required my phone call, and none of that required me to raise my voice in a kitchen or repeat myself at a dinner table. And I noted the new account numbers entering the frozen asset log, and I took a slow breath, and I turned back to the remaining files in my processing queue. On Tuesday morning, I arrived at my desk at 8:44 a.m. and I made tea instead of coffee, and I sat down and I opened my terminal, and the first thing the system showed me was an overnight escalation notification on the file I had confirmed the previous morning. And the notification indicated that the Global Scholar Passport and Fellowship Verification Bureau's Federal Investigations Division had reviewed the automated fraud report generated by the Level 1 flag and had officially opened a full criminal identity theft investigation and had assigned the file a permanent federal tracking number and had issued formal notification to all 147 affiliated passport jurisdictions. And I read the escalation notice from the first word to the last word, and then I took a slow sip of my tea and I opened the morning batch. It was Tuesday afternoon, and I was sitting inside the International Document Forensics Division on the 9th floor, which is 1 floor above my usual workstation, and the room is smaller than the operations room, and the lighting is slightly dimmer, and the terminals in this room are connected directly to the source verification servers of every Tier 1 academic institution in the world. And I had been granted temporary elevated access to this room at 11 a.m. by the Bureau's Federal Investigations Coordinator. Because the criminal identity theft file that had been opened overnight required a senior clearance officer to observe and authenticate the digital evidence assembly process. And I was the senior clearance officer assigned to observe. And I was sitting very straight in my chair, and my hands were flat on the desk. And the screen in front of me was showing the live data pull from the Oxford Elite Scholarship Foundation's original application server. The forensic system had submitted an automated retrieval request to Oxford's Secure Academic Records portal at 9 a.m. And by 2:15 p.m., the full application data package had been received and logged into the Bureau's evidence archive, and I was watching the forensic analyst beside me open the package layer by layer. And what the package contained was every version of every document that had been submitted under Vivienne's passport identity for the fellowship. And the system was now running those documents against the original application that I had submitted under my own identity 14 months ago. And the comparison was not complicated. because whoever had constructed the fraudulent submission had not been particularly careful. And the automated document integrity scanner identified the corruption points within the first 4 minutes of the comparison run. What the scanner showed was that my official academic transcript had been taken in digital form and opened in a basic image editing application, and my passport photograph had been removed from the identity header and replaced with a photograph of Vivienne, and the replacement had been done without any attempt to match the metadata encoding of the original file, and the scanner flagged 17 separate metadata inconsistencies in the first pass and logged all 17 as primary evidence markers. And the forensic analyst typed a single confirmation code, and the system absorbed all 17 markers into the federal case file. And I watched it do this, and I felt the particular sensation I always feel when an institution processes evidence correctly, which is not satisfaction, exactly, but something closer to recognition that the world occasionally works the way it is supposed to work. At 2:40 p.m., my office assistant sent me a message through the internal communication portal, informing me that my father had called my office direct line 5 times since noon, and that the calls were increasing in urgency, and that the most recent call had lasted 4 seconds because my father had apparently struggled to leave a coherent message, and I typed back a single instruction, which was to route all incoming communications from my family's registered contact numbers to the standard 30-day administrative review portal, which is a system the Bureau uses for managing unsolicited contact during active federal investigations, and which generates an automated acknowledgement message and nothing else, and my assistant confirmed the routing within 2 minutes. And after that point, my father's calls became the system's responsibility and not mine. At 3:07 p.m., the International Courier and Postal Intercept log generated an automated data drop into the case file, and I received a notification on my terminal, and I opened it. And what the log contained was a scanned copy of a delivery confirmation record from 14 months ago showing that a registered package from the Oxford Elite Scholarship Foundation had been delivered to my parents' home address, and that the package had been signed for by my mother, and the signature was clear, and the timestamp was clear, and the delivery confirmation included a recipient acknowledgement field that my mother had filled in by hand, and what she had written in that field was her own first name and the date and the words received in good condition. And I looked at that for a moment, and I thought about the specific conversation I had with my mother 3 days after that delivery date, when she told me that Oxford had sent a very brief and impersonal rejection letter, and that she had thrown it away because she did not want it sitting around the house making me feel bad. And I thought about how I had thanked her for that, and I returned to the screen. At 4:19 p.m., the home communications server, which is a secondary logging system connected to registered residential addresses, flagged 2 active federal cases, recorded an incoming voicemail, and routed a transcript of it to the case file, and I received a copy automatically as the observing senior officer, and the voicemail was from Vivienne, and it was described in the transcript header as distressed audio communication. And what Vivienne said was that the travel restriction on her passport had now generated secondary flags across every university admissions portal she had ever registered with, and that she had received automated rejection notifications from 3 postgraduate programs she had applied to, and that she believed the blacklisting was permanent and that she needed someone to fix it immediately. And her voice in the transcript was described as elevated, and the message ran for 4 minutes and 12 seconds. And I read the transcript from the first word to the last word without any change in my expression. And I closed the notification and I returned to the evidence assembly screen. At 5 p.m., the Forensic Division's automated case transmission system completed its packaging of the full identity theft and cross-border document fraud file. and I watched my terminal display the live confirmation as the Bureau transmitted the complete case file to the federal prosecutor's wing, and the transmission log showed 43 individual evidence items, and the case status updated from active federal investigation to prosecutorial review. And the system generated a permanent case reference number and logged it across all 147 affiliated jurisdictions. And I sat with my hands flat on the desk, and I watched the confirmation screen, and the gears were moving, and they were not going to stop. It was Wednesday morning, and I had arrived at the International Academic Travel Clearance Bureau headquarters at 8:39 a.m. And I had passed through the main lobby, the way I always pass through the main lobby, which is with my senior clearance lanyard visible and my administrator keycard already in my left hand and my eyes forward. And the lobby of this building is not a warm space. And it was not designed to be a warm space. And the floor is a very pale gray stone, and the ceiling is high, and the lighting comes from long horizontal panels set into the ceiling at precise intervals. And the sound in the lobby is always the same, which is the low mechanical hum of the automated biometric turnstile system, and the occasional soft click of an access card being read, and the quiet movement of people who work in buildings like this one, and who understand that this is not a place where you raise your voice. I had cleared the turnstiles and taken the elevator to the 8th floor, and I was at my workstation by 8:44 a.m. And I had opened my terminal, and I had pulled up the live security feed panel as part of my standard morning monitoring routine, because the active federal case attached to the fellowship file meant that the Bureau's security grid had flagged all registered contact addresses connected to the investigation for proximity monitoring. And my parents' names and Vivienne's name were all on that registry. And the system was designed to alert me if any of those names appeared in the building's entry log. And at 9:02 a.m., the alert appeared. I opened the lobby feed on a secondary panel on the right side of my terminal, and I watched. My parents had arrived with Vivienne, and there were two other individuals with them who were carrying briefcases and wearing the particular kind of dark suit that belongs to private defense lawyers. And the group of 5 crossed the main lobby floor toward the reception suite. And my mother was walking quickly, and her face was tight, and my father was carrying a thick folder of documents pressed against his chest, and Vivienne was slightly behind them, and she was wearing sunglasses inside the building, which told me everything I needed to know about the condition of her composure, and the 2 lawyers moved with the practiced efficiency of people who had been briefed on the way over and believed the briefing had prepared them for what they were walking into, and it had not prepared them for what they were walking into. At 9:07 a.m., Vivienne approached the visitor access turnstile on the left side of the lobby, and she produced a guest identification card, and she pressed it against the reader, and the reader processed the card, and the turnstile did not open, and the screen above the reader flashed a level 1 identity theft marker in red. And the entry token was blocked automatically because the Bureau's security system had cross-referenced the card's registered identity against the active international fraud investigation log and found a direct match, and the turnstile remained closed, and Vivienne stepped back and looked at the screen. And I watched her look at it, and I felt nothing except the quiet recognition that the system had just introduced itself to her, in the only language it speaks, which is the language of a closed gate. My father turned toward the security desk, and I watched him place his folder on the counter and begin speaking. And the security feed does not carry audio to my floor, but I did not need audio because the movement of his hands and the angle of his body and the way the security officer behind the desk had adopted the particular stillness that trained personnel adopt when a civilian is escalating told me everything. And he was waving the folder, and at one point he lifted a printed document from it and held it toward the officer. and the officer did not take it, and my father's mouth was moving continuously. And at 9:11 a.m., the lobby reception officer quietly pressed the internal escalation button beneath the desk, which I could see on the feed and which my father could not see at all. She called Mom. Mom called the clinic is a phrase I had heard my mother use once years ago when she was describing how our family handled problems, which was by calling each other in a chain until someone with authority was located and the problem was outsourced to that person. And I had grown up watching that system work for small things and medium things, and I had grown up being the person in the chain who was called last, if at all, and I had spent 28 years being the person in this family who was handed things after everyone else had already decided what those things were worth. And I watched my father wave his folder at a security officer, and I understood that the chain had reached its end. The doctor's reveal happened at 9:16 a.m. And what I mean by that is that Dr. Evelyn Vance, the Bureau's chief enforcement validator, stepped through the internal security door into the reception suite, and she had two armed security escorts positioned one step behind her on either side, and she was carrying nothing, and she needed to be carrying nothing. And she crossed the room to where the lawyers were standing, and she spoke directly to the senior lawyer, and I could not hear what she said. But the lawyer's posture changed within the first 10 seconds, and at 9:19 a.m., Dr. Vance turned and walked back through the internal security door, and the two escorts remained, and one of them gestured toward the corridor that leads to the lower ground verification wing, and my parents and Vivienne and their lawyers followed the gesture because there was nothing else left to do. I was sitting at my workstation on the 8th floor watching the security feed on my secondary panel, and I watched the five of them move through the lobby toward the lower ground corridor. And I watched the automated floor sensor log register their entry into the secure wing, and I watched the heavy door close behind them, and I turned back to my primary terminal, and I opened the morning batch, and I began to work. It was Wednesday morning at 11:15, and I was sitting in the high-back director chair in my private compliance suite on the 8th floor. And the chair is made of dark leather, and it is positioned facing the floor-to-ceiling glass wall that looks out over the city, and from this chair on a clear morning you can see a very long way. And Wednesday morning was clear. And I had been sitting in this position for approximately 4 minutes. And I was not looking at my terminal, and I was not reviewing any documents, and I was simply sitting with both hands resting in my lap and watching the city exist at a distance below me. And the suite behind me was quiet, in the way that rooms with thick acoustic glass walls are always quiet, which is a silence that does not feel like the absence of noise, but feels instead like the active suppression of it. And I had chosen this office 3 years ago, partly because of that quality, and I had never once regretted that choice. The executive elevator on the east side of the 8th floor requires a senior clearance code to operate, and my assistant had been given a temporary one-time access authorization at 11:08 a.m. and at 11:19 a.m. I heard the elevator doors open at the end of the corridor outside my suite, and I heard the measured sound of my assistant's footsteps, and behind them a different quality of movement, which was the movement of people who had spent the last 2 hours in a lower ground verification room being processed by federal enforcement staff and who were now moving through a building. They did not understand toward a meeting they had requested without knowing who was waiting for them at the end of it. My assistant opened the suite door and held it, and they came in. My parents entered first, and behind them came Vivienne. And behind Vivienne came the two defense lawyers, and the lawyers were still carrying their briefcases. But the energy with which they had carried those briefcases in the lobby 2 hours earlier had changed, and the confidence that a briefcase represents when a lawyer believes they are walking toward a negotiation had been replaced by something quieter and more careful. And my parents stopped a few steps inside the door, and my father looked at the room, and my mother looked at the room, and Vivienne stood slightly behind both of them. And the room they were looking at was a large room with a pale floor and a long desk of dark wood and floor-to-ceiling glass on two sides, and a single high-backed leather chair positioned behind the desk, facing away from them toward the city. And they could not see who was in the chair. I waited 4 seconds, and then I turned the chair around. The silence that followed was not like the silence of the room, which was architectural and designed and consistent, and I have described that silence already, and I know what it sounds like. And this silence was different because it was biological, and it arrived in the specific fraction of a second when my parents' eyes processed what they were seeing and sent that information forward to the part of the brain that handles recognition, and that part of the brain returned a result that the rest of the brain was not prepared to receive. And I watched it happen, and I watched the remaining air leave the room in that fraction of a second. And I watched my mother's hand move slightly toward my father's arm and stop halfway. And I watched my father's mouth open, and I watched Vivienne take a single step backward and make contact with the lawyer standing behind her. And I sat in my chair with my hands flat on the desk, and I looked at all of them, and I did not say anything. My father recovered first in the way that men who have never been held accountable by anything smaller than themselves tend to recover, which is loudly, and my father began speaking in a rising voice about family, and about privacy, and about the difference between a domestic misunderstanding and a federal criminal matter. And he used the word setup, and he used the phrase private family business, and he used the word unfair more than once. And his voice moved around the room, and the acoustic glass absorbed it and returned nothing. And I let him speak until the specific moment when his voice began to lose its own conviction, which took approximately 90 seconds, and then I opened the matte black compliance folder on the desk in front of me. I read from the biometric document forensics report, and I read the 17 metadata inconsistency markers, and I read the courier tracking confirmation codes, and I read the timestamp from the delivery log showing the date and time my mother had signed for the Oxford package 14 months ago. And I read these things in the same tone I use when I read evidence into any official record, which is level and clear and without inflection. And when I finished reading, I closed the folder and I placed both hands on top of it, and I looked at Vivienne. I explained to Vivienne that the Bureau's international regulations require all passport fraud and identity substitution attempts targeting federally registered scholarship awards to be referred automatically to the criminal prosecution wing upon case file transmission, and that the transmission had occurred at 5 p.m. on Tuesday, and that the referral was therefore not discretionary, and that the asset liquidation protocol attached to a criminal prosecution referral of this classification would proceed through the Federal Financial Enforcement Division on a timeline that was determined entirely by that division and not by me and not by anyone in this room. I stopped speaking. My parents were standing in front of my desk, and Vivienne was standing beside them, and the lawyers were standing behind all three of them. And nobody in the room was moving, and nobody in the room was speaking, and my father was no longer holding his folder against his chest, and my mother's hand had finally completed its journey to my father's arm and was resting there without gripping. And Vivienne was looking at me with an expression I had never seen on her face before, which was the expression of a person who has just understood something about the architecture of the world that they cannot unknow, and what they were all understanding in that moment, standing completely still in front of my desk, was that the daughter they had spent years overlooking and lying to and erasing from her own achievements was sitting in the chair that controlled the system that was now controlling everything about their lives, and that there was no chain left to call, and no clinic at the end of it, and no one further up to reach. It was still Wednesday morning, and they were still standing in front of my desk, and I reached forward, and I opened my terminal, and I navigated to the official passport fraud transmission portal, which is a secure government interface that requires a senior director biometric scan and a dual confirmation code before any document package can be formally dispatched to the Criminal Fraud Division. And I placed my right thumb on the biometric reader set into the side of the terminal, and the reader processed my print in approximately 2 seconds and returned a green confirmation. And I entered my dual code, and the transmission interface opened, and the complete unauthorized fellowship dissolution file was already loaded and waiting because the system had assembled it automatically over the preceding 48 hours. And it contained every piece of evidence the forensic division had extracted, and every metadata marker, and every courier tracking code, and the full 14 months of identity substitution activity logged against my original application. And I moved the cursor to the dispatch confirmation, and I clicked it once, and the screen showed a transmission progress bar, and the progress bar completed in 11 seconds, and the screen returned a permanent case lodgment reference number. And I wrote nothing down because the reference number was already archived in 6 separate federal databases, and I did not need to write it down. I looked up. My father was watching the terminal screen, and his face had the quality of a person watching a door close on the other side of a very long corridor, and understanding for the first time that the corridor had always been moving, and that they had been standing still inside it. And my mother was not looking at the screen, and was not looking at me, and was looking at a point somewhere between the desk and the floor. And Vivienne was standing very straight in the way that people stand when they are trying to prevent their body from doing something their body very much wants to do. And the 2 lawyers exchanged a single look and said nothing. And the federal security escorts, who had been waiting outside my suite door since 11:15, entered the room at my assistant's signal and crossed the pale floor and positioned themselves on either side of the group. And the senior escort said something brief and professional, and the group began to move toward the door, and I watched them move, and I did not stand, and I did not speak. And as they passed through the door and into the corridor, I turned my chair back toward the glass wall and the city below, and I heard the suite door close behind them, and the acoustic silence of the room returned to its normal quality, and I sat in it, and I breathed. Over the following 3 months, the Automated International Probate Authority processed the asset recovery procedure attached to the criminal fraud referral, and the procedure moved exactly as the system documentation stated it would move, which is without pause and without negotiation, and without the requirement of any further input from me, and my parents' home equity was assessed, and a permanent liquidation order was issued by the Federal Financial Enforcement Division to recover the full value of the illegally diverted fellowship funds, plus the accumulated statutory penalties that apply to a document conspiracy of this classification. And the total figure attached to the liquidation order was larger than the fellowship itself, because the penalties compound from the date of the original fraudulent act, and the date of the original fraudulent act was 14 months ago. And 14 months of compounding penalties on a £180,000 base is a number that removes options, and my parents' options were removed, and the liquidation proceeded, and the Financial Enforcement Division filed the outcome as a matter of public record, because that is what the regulations require, and a matter of public record means that the fraud flag attached to my family's name exists in a searchable federal database and will continue to exist there on a permanent basis. And Vivienne's global academic profile remained blacklisted, across all 147 affiliated jurisdictions. And the 3 postgraduate programs that had issued automated rejections did not reverse those rejections, and no new applications were accepted because the system does not accept applications from profiles carrying a Level 1 identity theft marker. And that is not a policy that can be appealed to a person because it is not administered by a person. In the weeks that followed, my parents attempted to reach me through a sequence of intermediaries, and the intermediaries included 2 family friends and 1 distant relative and a woman from my mother's community group who had been told a version of events that bore no meaningful resemblance to the documented record. And each of these people contacted my office block, and each contact was received by my assistant and routed to the standard 30-day administrative review portal, and the portal generated an automated acknowledgement and nothing further. And after several weeks, the attempts stopped, and I noted when they stopped, and I returned to my work, I had already begun the process of separating every administrative layer of my life from my family's contact information. And I submitted a formal update to the Oxford Elite Scholarship Foundation, reinstating my original fellowship application under my verified identity. And the foundation processed the reinstatement within 10 working days and issued a revised award confirmation. And I began making arrangements, and I moved my financial channels to accounts registered solely to my senior director profile, and I updated my international passport records and my emergency contact designations and my residential correspondence address, and each update was a clean administrative action, and none of them required a conversation. On a Thursday evening, approximately 3 months after Wednesday, I was standing on the narrow balcony outside my executive suite, and it was raining, and the city below was the same city it always is, which is gray and lit and continuous and indifferent to the specific weight of any individual life moving through it. And I was holding my phone, and the screen was clean, and there were 0 notifications and no calls waiting and no messages queued, and the only sound was the rain landing on the stone railing in front of me. And I stood there for a while, and I looked at the clean screen, and I thought about the word concrete, which is a word that means dense and load-bearing and resistant to the application of external pressure. And I have always been the concrete daughter in a house that preferred glass. And glass is beautiful, and glass catches the light, and everyone looks at glass, and concrete holds the building up, and nobody looks at concrete until the building comes down, and the building had come down, and I was still standing, and the passport pipeline was completely clear, and Oxford was waiting, and I went back inside.